Great, thank you so much for having me. I'm a bit of a fish out of water because I'm a pediatric urologist, so you could argue that I'm trying to prevent sexual dysfunction from the get-go. So I have no disclosures other than that I am the chair of the ACGME-RC, and I will be speaking a lot about the ACGME, but everything is my own view, my own opinion, but I'm hoping to shed some light on the accreditation process. So here's what I want to accomplish in the next few minutes. I'm going to share a little bit about the story of accreditation in pediatric urology and what that journey looked like. I'll offer some hints on the real scoop of the ACGME and how to have a successfully accredited program. Then I'll share a possible roadmap for your subspecialty and finish up with some takeaways, some do's and don'ts. So we know that in urology we have several different fellowship programs, but what's really important to note is that only pediatric urology and FPRMS are currently the accredited fellowships recognized by the ACGME. And the reason this is important is because these two fellowships have to adhere to a very strict standard in terms of training. Now, when thinking about accreditation, you really have to think about the symbiotic relationship between the American Board of Urology, American Board of Urology and the ACGME. And that's because for our three accredited specialties, general urology, FPRMS, and pediatric urology, our program requirements really are really derived from what the board dictates in terms of certification. So I'm going to share a little bit about the road to accreditation and certification from a pediatric urology perspective. So pediatric urology fellowships started in the 1970s, and at that time, stakeholders gathered and said, you know, we really want some special recognition because we're doing extra training for a completely different patient population with completely different disease processes and performing completely different surgeries, and we want our patients, their parents, and our referring providers to recognize that. So in 1991, they went to the ACGME and they appealed for accreditation, and that's when ACGME approved pediatric urology fellowships. So then that led to the certification process, and what I would charge your subspecialty to think about is not only the accreditation process, but do you also want to pursue the certification road as well. So in 1995, stakeholders appealed to the ABU and said we need to have a pediatric in-service exam. And this was not only a knowledge assessment for pediatric urology fellows, but really became the precursor to the subspecialty certification exam. Then the Pediatric Urology Advisory Council assembled and approached the ABU and said, okay, we want a certification of a CAQ, an additional certification basically. And they submitted a proposal, and finally in 2006, ABU said, yeah, okay, we'll offer you that subspecialty certification. And the first certification exam was written in 2007. But from the onset of fellowships in pediatric urology to the certification process, it took literally decades to get there. Now, when we think about accreditation and the ACGME, I recognize that the ACGME isn't the only accrediting body, but it's the only one that we know in urology. And what's really essential to the ACGME are the 6 core competencies, and those include patient care, communication, medical knowledge, professionalism, practice-based learning, and systems-based practice. And the reason that these are important is because they're interwoven into all of the program requirements for training. And that includes the ACGME milestones. The milestones are a project that came out a little over 10 years ago, basically to help with competency-based medical training. The idea is that the milestones fall under the 6 core competencies and that they help shepherd trainees through the transition from being a learner to practicing independently and reaching competence in all of those 6 core competencies. So these are just some screenshots of what milestones look like when we're completing them, for example, for urology residents. And the reason that I bring this to your attention is because not only as program directors for an accredited program would you need to complete these twice a year for your trainees, but in order to get to that point, you need to actually develop milestones for your specific subspecialty. And so there's a lot to think about in the accreditation process. There's a lot that the ACGME demands of us in training. So we have to think about the 6 core competencies. We have to think about adhering to all of the common program requirements, which includes things like having well-being programs, thinking about your transitions of care, quality improvement projects, patient safety, fatigue mitigation. I mean, there's just a lot. It can be really overwhelming. Another thing to think about is the duration of training and the type of training. So how much clinical time are you going to have? How much research time might you have? So again, going back to the pediatric urology example, traditionally it's been a total of 24 months. So we used to have a clean 12 months of clinical and then 12 months of research. And the clinical time was recognized by the ACGME, but the research time wasn't. The board said you have to have 2 years of training, but only the ACGME will recognize the clinical training. And the reason that was important is because during the research time, pediatric urology fellows could actually practice 20% of their time. They could spend time in independent practice and they could actually bill. And so that's really important for funding. And when you think about accreditation, you also have to think about that piece too, because as we all know, GME funding is pretty tight these days. Now we have moved on to a more flexible system where both of the years of training are recognized by the ACGME, and we now have to have at least 12 months of clinical training in pediatrics and up to 12 months of research. So there's a little more flexibility there. It's not so clean cut. But at the same time, now both years are accredited. So there's no opportunity for our fellows to practice independently or bill to subsidize some of their salary. So again, you have to think about what is the duration of training going to be, how much clinical time are your fellows going to spend, how much research time, and is it all going to be accredited time? Another thing you have to think about is case minimums. So the case minimums are what the RC use to really assess the breadth and depth of procedural training. And every one of the accredited specialties has their own list of case minimums. So this is not meant to be a substitute for competence. It's really to offer trainees an extensive breadth of training. But this is another thing to think about in the accreditation process. And you have to have the institutional volume in order to support the case minimums. So when you're pursuing accreditation, what we look for as an RC is a sound educational rationale, that your institution has enough volume to support case minimums, that you have enough faculty. I'm sure for a smaller fellowship, that's not as much of an issue. You have to have a well-organized block diagram. For the sake of time, I didn't go into detail about that, but it's essentially following a template where you have to outline the specific rotations for your trainees and adhere to that year to year. And you have to have support from your sponsoring institution and your designated institutional officer. But once you're accredited, you have to maintain accreditation. You have to make sure that you have positive responses on your ACGME trainee surveys and faculty surveys. You have to submit on-time annual updates that are really thorough. You have to make sure all your trainees are meeting those case minimums. You have to make sure your trainees are engaging in scholarly activity. And, of course, you have to make sure that they pass their boards if you get to the certification process. Now, this is, I recognize, a lot. And so you might be thinking, okay, there's so many requirements, there's so much that we have to do. Is this worth it? And I'd say, yes, absolutely. If you're passionate about this, as we were in pediatric urology, absolutely 100% go for it. And the ACGME is here to help. So here's what a roadmap might look like for your subspecialty. First, you have to start by partnering with the ABU and the RC. And then you have to develop program requirements for your individual subspecialty. You need to outline those milestones, and you need to develop your case minimums. Then programs have to decide, are they in or are they out? Which programs are going to choose to pursue the accreditation process? Are all programs going to be accredited? Some of the FPMRS programs are actually not accredited. You have to get institutional approval from your DIO, and then you have to apply for accreditation through the ACGME. And then finally, you have to uphold the standard, and how are you going to do that? Are you going to pursue a certificate of added qualification? So I'll leave you with just a few do's and don'ts in the accreditation process. So first, you have to decide, are you in or out? Is your subspecialty going to pursue accreditation? And then if you do, which programs are going to choose to pursue accreditation individually? You have to partner with stakeholders, especially the ABU, and think about, okay, are we going to pursue accreditation, but are we also going to pursue certification? And you have to have representation for your subspecialty on the ABU Board of Trustees and on the RC, and you do currently, but you have to maintain that. And of course, you have to partner with your sponsoring institution. You also have to think a little bit about what impact is accreditation going to have, particularly on general urologists that also practice sexual medicine. Now, some don'ts. So don't disregard the accreditation requirements. You can't blow these off. These are taken very seriously. And in order to maintain your accreditation, you have to adhere to them. Don't assume once you're in, you're always in. You have to keep adhering to those requirements. And don't get frustrated. I mean, you saw in the pediatric urology journey, the story that I shared, it took decades. But honestly, as a subspecialty, we're happy. We're in a really good place right now. Don't forget why you want to do this. If this is something that you're really passionate about, follow your purpose. So thank you so much for giving me the platform, and I look forward to further discussion.